In this episode, we're going to talk about consequences in a way that is realistic and useful because privacy program management gets a lot clearer when you understand what actually happens when an organization does not meet its obligations. The Certified Information Privacy Manager, CIPM, exam is not trying to scare you, but it does expect you to understand that privacy is enforced through real outcomes, not just through good intentions. New learners sometimes assume noncompliance is a single event, like you either comply or you do not, and then a fine appears like a movie plot twist. Real consequences are usually layered, and they can build over time through complaints, investigations, audits, partner pressure, and internal breakdowns. We'll look at what noncompliance means in practice, how consequences show up at the organizational level, and how they can also land on individuals through job accountability and, in some cases, legal exposure. By the end, you should be able to explain these consequences calmly and connect them to why privacy programs emphasize governance, documentation, and repeatable processes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Noncompliance, in privacy program terms, is not only breaking a law on purpose, and it is not only having a breach, even though breaches often trigger attention. Noncompliance is failing to meet obligations that apply to your processing, including obligations created by territorial rules, sectoral rules, and contracts with partners and customers. It can be as visible as using personal information for a purpose you never disclosed, or as quiet as failing to honor a deletion request within required timelines. It can also be structural, like having no reliable inventory of where personal information lives, which makes it impossible to respond consistently to rights requests or to assess risk. Beginners sometimes think noncompliance requires bad intent, but many privacy failures come from poor processes, unclear roles, or rushed decision-making that bypasses review. This matters because consequences often depend on what the organization knew, what it documented, and whether it can demonstrate reasonable program management. If you cannot show your decision-making trail, regulators and partners often assume the worst, even when the problem began as a mistake. At the organizational level, one major consequence category is regulatory action, and it helps to understand the range of outcomes regulators can pursue. Some situations begin with complaints from individuals, which can lead to inquiries asking the organization to explain what it does and why. If responses are incomplete, inconsistent, or unsupported by evidence, regulators may escalate to formal investigations, and investigations often require time, documentation, interviews, and repeated submissions. Regulatory outcomes can include orders to change practices, to stop certain processing, to improve transparency, or to implement stronger controls within specific timeframes. In some cases, regulators can impose penalties, and even when the penalty amount is not the most damaging piece, the ongoing oversight and required remediation work can be intense. A privacy program manager should recognize that regulators often look for patterns, such as repeated failures to honor rights, unclear lawful basis reasoning, or misleading notices. When the organization cannot demonstrate a managed program, regulatory attention tends to increase, and that increased attention becomes its own operational burden. Financial consequences are often the first thing people imagine, but privacy-related financial impact is broader than fines. Organizations can face direct penalties, but they can also face legal costs, investigation costs, and the cost of external advisors brought in under pressure. Remediation work can be expensive because it often arrives as an urgent priority, requiring rushed engineering changes, expanded staffing, new workflows, and accelerated training. There are also opportunity costs, such as delaying product launches, pausing marketing campaigns, or limiting data-driven initiatives while the organization stabilizes. Another financial consequence is litigation, which can include class action exposure in some contexts, or private claims depending on jurisdiction and the nature of harm. Even when litigation is ultimately resolved, the process consumes leadership attention and disrupts normal operations. Insurance can help with certain incident-related costs, but it rarely covers the full business impact, especially when the root issue is governance failure rather than a single security event. From a program perspective, the takeaway is that noncompliance turns privacy from a planned investment into an emergency expense, and emergency expenses are almost always higher. Operational disruption is a consequence category that beginners underestimate because it can feel invisible until it happens. When an organization is found to be noncompliant, it often has to redirect people from normal work to urgent remediation, which creates delays across many teams. Product teams may need to rebuild data flows, reduce collection, add consent or choice mechanisms, or change retention logic, and those changes can be complicated when systems are interconnected. Customer support teams may face a surge in questions, complaints, and rights requests, and if the organization does not have a mature process, response quality can drop quickly. Legal and privacy teams may be pulled into constant triage, reviewing messaging, coordinating with regulators, and managing documentation requests. Security teams may need to increase monitoring or adjust controls if the noncompliance relates to access or disclosure. Vendor management may need to reassess partners and renegotiate terms if third-party processing contributed to the issue. The overall effect is that the organization's normal rhythm breaks, and breaking the rhythm often creates more errors, which can compound the original problem. Reputational damage is another organizational consequence, and it is one of the hardest to repair because it is driven by trust rather than by a checklist. When people hear that a company mishandled personal information, they often assume the company is careless or deceptive, even if the details are more nuanced. Loss of trust can reduce customer acquisition, increase churn, and make people less willing to share information, which can directly affect business models that depend on data. Reputational impact can also affect employees, because people want to work for organizations they respect, and internal morale can suffer when staff feel they are defending avoidable mistakes. Partners may become cautious, especially if they worry that your practices could create risk for them through shared processing. Reputation also influences regulatory posture, because a pattern of public complaints can drive higher scrutiny and stronger enforcement responses. A key program point is that reputational damage often comes not only from the mistake, but from how the organization responds, including whether it communicates clearly and demonstrates that it is improving. When a privacy program is mature, it can respond with discipline, and that discipline can limit reputational harm. Contractual and commercial consequences are a major part of privacy reality, especially for organizations that sell to enterprise customers or operate in complex partner ecosystems. Many contracts include privacy and data protection requirements, and failing to meet them can trigger audits, penalties, termination rights, or loss of renewal. A customer may require you to demonstrate controls through questionnaires or assessments, and noncompliance can cause deals to stall or collapse. Some organizations also face consequences through platform policies, app store rules, and partner program requirements, which can restrict distribution or monetization if privacy practices are found lacking. Vendor relationships can also become unstable because partners may demand stricter terms, additional reporting, or changes in data sharing patterns that complicate operations. Even when the organization avoids regulatory fines, losing a major customer, failing a partner assessment, or being removed from a preferred vendor list can be financially devastating. These consequences reinforce a core CIPM idea. Privacy programs are not only compliance programs, they are business-enabling programs that protect revenue and partnerships. When you treat privacy obligations seriously, you are protecting market access as much as you are avoiding penalties. Now let's shift to individual-level consequences, because privacy programs depend on people, and accountability often lands on specific roles when failures occur. Individual consequences do not always mean legal punishment, but they often involve professional accountability, performance evaluations, and changes in job responsibilities. If a person ignores policies, bypasses required reviews, or misuses personal information, the organization may impose discipline up to and including termination, especially if the behavior appears intentional or reckless. If a manager fails to enforce procedures, fails to ensure training, or pressures teams to skip controls, that can also create accountability, because leadership responsibility includes maintaining compliance culture. Individuals may also face reputational harm in their careers because privacy and trust roles depend heavily on credibility, and a public failure can follow someone to future opportunities. In some situations, individuals are required to participate in investigations, interviews, and documentation efforts, which can be stressful and time-consuming. A mature program reduces these individual pressures by building clear processes and removing ambiguity, because ambiguity is where individuals make inconsistent choices that later get judged harshly. Legal exposure for individuals varies widely depending on jurisdiction, sector, and the nature of the conduct, but it is still important to understand the concept at a high level. Some privacy-related laws and regulations can create personal liability in certain circumstances, particularly where there is intentional misconduct, fraud, obstruction of an investigation, or willful violations of duties. Sectoral environments can also include professional obligations that carry penalties for individuals, especially where protected data types are mishandled knowingly or where reporting duties are deliberately ignored. Even when the primary enforcement target is the organization, regulators may scrutinize governance failures and ask who made decisions, who approved exceptions, and whether leadership ignored known risks. Individuals might also face consequences through professional licensing or ethical expectations in certain roles, depending on the field. For exam purposes, the practical takeaway is that privacy is not an abstract corporate issue, because real people make decisions, and documentation often reveals who made them and why. The risk is usually highest when behavior is intentional or when warnings were ignored, which is why program discipline emphasizes documented reasoning and escalation. Employment-related consequences are often the most immediate individual impact, and they show up when privacy expectations are not clear or when people feel pressured to cut corners. If a frontline employee mishandles a rights request, shares personal information improperly, or uses data outside approved purposes, the organization may treat it as a training issue, a process issue, or a misconduct issue, depending on the circumstances. If the organization never trained the employee, never provided clear procedures, or created impossible workloads, the program itself shares responsibility, and mature organizations treat that as a signal to fix the system. If the employee ignored clear rules, bypassed controls, or acted carelessly, consequences can become disciplinary, because the organization must protect trust and reduce repeated risk. Managers can face consequences when they fail to enforce policies or when they create a culture where privacy steps are mocked or skipped. Privacy leaders can face consequences if they fail to build measurable oversight, fail to escalate known risks, or fail to align stakeholders in a way that makes compliance possible. This is why CIPM thinking emphasizes roles and accountability, because individual consequences often trace back to structural clarity. It is also worth acknowledging that individual consequences can be psychological and cultural, not just formal, because privacy failures create stress in a way that can damage teams long after the technical fixes are complete. When an organization is under investigation or facing public scrutiny, employees may feel anxious, defensive, or afraid to make decisions, which can slow work and reduce innovation. Teams may begin to avoid documenting decisions because documentation feels risky, which is dangerous because good documentation is what protects both the program and individuals. People may blame each other across departments, especially if responsibilities were unclear, and that blame can destroy stakeholder alignment, making future privacy work harder. A mature program responds by reinforcing that privacy is a shared system responsibility, clarifying roles, and improving processes rather than using fear as a motivator. This cultural dimension matters because trust inside the organization affects whether people report issues early, and early reporting is one of the most effective ways to prevent larger harm. From an exam standpoint, you should recognize that consequences are not only external punishments, because internal culture changes can either strengthen or weaken the program after an incident. A privacy program manager aims for a learning culture that reduces fear while still enforcing accountability. Understanding consequences also helps you understand why privacy programs invest in prevention and evidence, because prevention reduces harm and evidence reduces confusion when questions arise. Prevention includes clear policies, practical procedures, training that matches real workflows, and governance that ensures privacy is involved early in changes to processing. Evidence includes inventories, assessment records, documented decisions, vendor oversight records, and metrics that show whether controls are working. When an organization can show that it has a structured program, regulators and partners often view mistakes differently than when the organization appears unmanaged or evasive. Evidence also protects individuals because documented escalation and decision trails show that someone followed process and raised concerns appropriately. This is one of the most important reasons a program charter, governance model, and measurement cadence matter, because they create the system that produces evidence naturally. Beginners sometimes think documentation is about bureaucracy, but in privacy programs it is often about clarity, accountability, and defensibility. When you connect consequences to prevention and evidence, you stop seeing program controls as optional and start seeing them as risk management tools. For exam performance, it helps to translate consequence thinking into a simple decision lens that you can apply to scenarios without getting overwhelmed. When a question asks what happens if the organization ignores an obligation, think of layered organizational consequences like regulatory attention, remediation cost, operational disruption, and reputational harm, because those layers often appear together. When a question asks about accountability, think of individual consequences in terms of job responsibility, disciplinary outcomes, and the expectation that decisions are documented and escalated appropriately. When a question asks what the program manager should do, the best answer usually aims to reduce future consequences by strengthening governance, clarifying roles, and building repeatable processes that prevent repeated failures. It also often involves stakeholder alignment, because friction and bypassing are common roots of noncompliance. If a scenario includes repeated issues, the exam is usually testing whether you choose a systemic fix rather than a one-time patch, because systemic fixes reduce long-term consequence risk. If a scenario includes a high-impact event, the exam often expects you to consider both immediate response and program improvement, because durable programs learn and adjust. Thinking in consequence layers helps you choose the option that reflects mature program management. As we close, the main idea is that noncompliance has consequences that are real, layered, and often more disruptive than people expect, and those consequences are a major reason privacy program management exists as a discipline. Organizations can face regulatory investigations, corrective orders, penalties, litigation costs, and heavy remediation work that disrupts normal operations and consumes attention. They can also face reputational and commercial damage through loss of trust, partner pressure, contract failures, and slowed growth, which can be more painful than any single fine. Individuals can face professional accountability through discipline, job impact, and reputational harm, and in certain circumstances they can face legal exposure, especially when conduct is intentional or when obligations are knowingly ignored. The healthiest privacy programs respond to this reality by building prevention, evidence, and clarity, so mistakes are less likely and responses are more controlled when problems occur. When you can explain consequences at both organizational and individual levels and connect them to why charters, governance, training, and measurement matter, you are thinking like a privacy program manager. That is exactly the kind of practical, system-focused understanding the CIPM exam is designed to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.